Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and good night uh, to everybody. We are starting this webinar now. Thank you for joining us today. I know that we'll have more people joining as we go forward, but I want to start on time. My name is Neeraj Gupta. I'm the Technical Director for Subsurface and Carbon Management work at Battelle. And I think I know many, if not all of you. So it's good to see many familiar faces and also some new faces on this webinar. This webinar series is a continuation of the technical outreach that we have started under DOE-funded regional partnership programs like Midwest Regional Carbon Initiatives and MRCSP. And at Battelle, we would like to continue that technical outreach both on CCS, but also all of the emerging energy topics, whether it's enhanced oil recovery, how to increase the use of coal, how to work on geothermal energy, how to work on nuclear energy. So this will be a broad set of series of webinars that we would start about on a monthly basis. And these will be shared through our mailing list that we started under the MRCI program, the Midwest Regional Carbon Initiative program, and also through LinkedIn. If you would like to be on the mailing list, or if you would like not to be on the mailing list, please do let us know in this case. This meeting will be recorded, and we will make a decision to share most likely through the MRCI website, the midwestccus.org, or the Explore ACS project website, explore-acs.org, with some editing, so we may not post a Q&A. I want to start with a welcome to everybody who has joined so far and others who will join. Just for housekeeping, there will be a brief Q&A period after each of these presentations, the two presentations. So please raise your hand if you have a question. You could also post it in the chat, but we may or may not get to it. And we will leave some time after both webinars for additional questions or discussion if somebody wants to stick around. But currently we have about 5 minutes for each Q&A session after each webinar. I want to start also with the safety movement. And there's a lot of safety topics, but what I want to say is that as we plan and our projects and field work, it's very often easy to overlook what you would need for safety. Having done a lot of field projects by our team, whether drilling, injection of CO₂, please make sure that you budget enough time, appropriate staff, and support, as well as budget for safety oversight and safety planning on your projects, because I think that could make or break any of the projects we do for the industry. So with those general words, I do also want to thank the sponsors for both of these webinars, and both Joel and Jared will mention the sponsors. But broadly, I want to thank DOE, Department of Energy, so Hydrocarbon Office, for their sustained support for Battelle programs over last 2 or 3 decades. And what you're going to see today is the outcome from those projects. Jared Hawkins will be talking more about onshore stuff. What you saw was really onshore to offshore and East Coast solution. But within the Appalachian Basin, there is a lot of options, but many of them will need, and not just here, but globally, you will need multimodal transport. So this was a DOE-funded project, again, for looking at what kind of, trains, planes, automobiles, whatever you can use to move CO₂ to the storage locations. It was a pre-FEED study, and I'll give you Jared Hawkins, who's also one of our most experienced team members. Jared, you're on mute.
You think I'd be used to that by now. What I was saying is, unfortunately, we did not get to look at planes, but love the movie reference. I wanted to begin by acknowledging the PM for the project, Evan Burns. Obviously, the Department of Energy Hydrocarbons and Geothermal Energy Office, or formerly Fossil Energy Office. Our cost share partners, CNX, EQT, and Hope Gas, have interests in the area we were looking at, and were kind enough to lend us their cost share. TRC Companies was our technical partner. I want to specifically thank Dave Elam and his team. He's since retired, but wish him well, and Denise Brindley. And then the Battelle task leads and other staff that helped me, namely Devin Dixon, Ryan Adams, Emma Brackman, Alex Cordero, Brandon Webster, Jagannathan Mahadevan, and obviously Neeraj. Couldn't have done this without them. Let's see here. Advancing my slides. Here's the disclaimer. So the agenda for my talk today is just kind of giving you background and the location, as well as our thinking of why we proposed this project. We'll go through the conceptual design for the project, including the scenario development that we used to come up with a realistic pre-feed scenario, some of the project assumptions, the regional connections that will be needed, our permitting and regulatory assessment, the business case analysis, environmental health and safety risk assessment, and then finally we'll round it out with some key findings. So the project background, essentially why the Central Appalachian Basin? Well, there are basically two prongs of reasons as to why we chose this area. First of all, it's a really important industrial area where there are sources of varying sizes and purities. We've got everything from natural gas processing to steel plants, chemical plants, refineries, electric power plants, and most of the things in between. In addition, we've got some challenging storage prospects. There are some promising ones, particularly in the Cambro-Ordovician and some of the younger sediments in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, but these are largely, they largely need some additional work to kind of prove them up. And so kind of combining those two things with the fact that there is expected to be some demand for CCS prospects as the ARCH2 program starts ramping up, we kind of decided that this would be an interesting area to look into for intermodal transport in particular. So during this presentation and the report that resulted from this work, we basically discussed two different levels of the project. The first was the hub-wide level, where we had two different conceptual scenarios. One of our scenarios used existing sources of various sizes, mostly natural gas processing and gathering and booster stations. And the other layered in a newly built hydrogen plant. And this was to simulate what essentially what the ARCH2 project would do to the region after a intermodal transport hub was completed. So essentially what layering in that additional CO₂, that additional fairly large source will do to the overall development of the scenario. And then finally, our second scenario was zooming in on a specific node within the hub to actually complete the pre-feed concepts. So the conceptual scenarios are where we actually look at what makes sense to transport, how and where. So this is where our mode selection is, whether we're using truck, rail, or pipeline, as well as where our gathering points are. And then the pre-feed node for the more detailed analysis was actually selected in Washington County, Pennsylvania. And the reason that we selected this specific location is because it was the only location within our overall concepts where all three modes of transport came together in one area. So it was where we selected as the most interesting area, where we're going to have a bunch of different types of interconnections and we'll have to deal with CO₂ coming in at various pressures and on various modes. So the conceptual site development, starting with those high level sources and sinks, essentially we developed some what I call anonymized sources, which are of similar sizes and types to the sources that are in the area. I mentioned natural gas compressors and gathering and boosting stations. With the development of the Marcellus and Utica, that's been kind of, those types of sources have kind of exploded in the area. So we selected those as what our realistic existing sources would be. The sinks that we identified were all kind of based on either work that we had done previously at Battelle and other DOE sponsored work, as well as some publicly announced CCS projects that are in the area. And we really focused in on this the sink labeled S2 here as one of the more promising ones that we had studied in the past, and one in which we found that a commercial scale project was feasible. The initial mode selection was actually conducted considering trucking, rail, pipeline, and barge. Barge didn't make a ton of sense just because of where the sources were located relative to the I'm sorry, where the sources and sinks were located relative to um the actual ports where you could feasibly conduct barge. So like there's the Port of Pittsburgh, that's under this massive sources here, and then the other port within our area is actually off the map down here in the tri-state area port, and it really wouldn't have made sense to barge it down here and then take it back up to our storage site in eastern Ohio. So we abandoned barging as a concept, although it is for this specific project, although it is a feasible mode if you're looking to transport it further afield. So for our mode selection, we actually made a series of decision trees. The first input is the distance from the source you're considering to the next node. The second is the volume you're transporting. We had an ease of pipeline construction, which kind of considered where the source was located relative to sensitive areas in particular. The distance to rail yards is an important consideration when you're thinking about transporting via rail. And then finally, we wanted to prevent any disruptions to local traffic patterns. So we did this by considering the distance of the source to a major highway. We didn't want to, send a bunch of trucks through a small town downtown, or send a bunch of trucks on a residential road, or a smaller rural highway. Instead, we were focused more on the state highways and obviously the interstates. So the two scenarios here are designed to deliver an average of around 4,400 metric tons of CO₂ a day to the storage facility in Tuscarawas, Ohio. And I just have a few animations here to kind of walk through some of the findings. First of all, we focused on natural gas sources for the existing anonymized sources. The three different transport modes, as I kind of covered earlier, are represented here. Black is rail, The peach color is truck, and then blue is pipeline. Trucks are handling the shorter distances, particularly in this anonymized existing scenario. There's a few truck routes that are delivering CO₂ to rail yards, and one that is delivering it directly to the pre-feed node that's in Washington County here. The trains are handling the medium distances and volumes. So these are essentially, if you consider this rail yard down here where you see the 11, there are a number of different smaller sources that are kind of pooling and combining here and then transporting up to the pre-feed node where the pipeline and another rail yard are also coming in. And then finally the pipeline is handling the larger volumes and the longer distances. When you build a hydrogen plant, and this one is, sorry, hit the wrong button there. This one is considering building a hydrogen plant in northern West Virginia. This disrupts some of the existing routes that we had planned. So if you compare, excuse me, the anonymized existing sources with the hydrogen plant here, essentially we're getting rid of two of the truck routes, including one of the longer truck routes, in favor of these smaller pipelines being built directly to this hydrogen plant, where it will then transport up to the pre-feed node. And then this rail yard one hub, Washington County, PA pre-feed node, is kind of where we're going next in the presentation. So some of the assumptions that we used for our pre-feed assessment was considering the transport only. So capture, we're assuming that the CO₂ plants are delivering their CO₂ to these specific nodes at the proper purity and compression and initial compression for for transport. Our study considers for truck and rail liquefaction and all intermediate storage as part of our study, compression to pipeline specs as you're moving through pipelines, and then any interconnections between the modes, as well as actually executing the transport. Once the CO₂ leaves the pipeline at the Eastern Ohio storage site, it's no longer a part of our study. So any intermediate storage or compression required for injection or the actual act of injecting is not really a part of our considerations. We assumed a 2% total downtime for each of the capture plants, and we assigned these randomly. And this was used for flow assurance. So in other words, we assumed 1 week a year, each one of the sources at different times throughout the year would be offline and no longer delivering CO₂. This is not a huge deal if it's a smaller source, but it becomes a bigger deal as the sources are larger and larger. And this is kind of used to simulate the variance and flow rates that are expected because of annual maintenance on the capture plants. Trains were assumed to run as 80-unit train cars. Each car could transport 80 metric tons per car. And then the pipeline where it was assumed to be operating continuously and sized using ANSI Schedule 80 steel pipe. And then the capacity factors were determined based on the location class. So the land use impacted the overall capacity factor for each of these pipelines. So for this is just kind of going through each of the the movement of CO₂ through each of the scenarios. The one thing I would focus on here is we do have a battery of storage tanks at this pre-feed site that we have on the map here. These are horizontal tanks. Each of these three areas is capable of holding a total of 4,400 metric tons. And this was used to store excess CO₂, particularly as those trains are coming in. And we wanted to maintain a fairly consistent flow rate in our pipeline. So as those trains are coming in, you need areas to store the excess CO₂. You also need to consider not dropping below a minimum flow rate of CO₂ when some of the larger sources go offline. So that we found that this amount of above ground storage was needed to effectively maintain consistent flow rates of CO₂ in our project. The flow assurance, I realize I'm spending a lot of time here, so I'm going to fly through some of these. But the flow assurance is shown here for the second scenario. So the scenario with the hydrogen plant, and so this is the total CO₂ flow. Peach is pipeline, the blue is truck, and each of these dots is a unit train coming in. So you can see the spikes of CO₂ as the unit trains show up, and but ultimately our outflow rate down here is maintained fairly consistently at this is scenario 2, so it's a little higher. So it's fairly consistently most days is around 5,900 tons. It can get up to 6,300, but never drops below 3,800. The regulations and permitting, we basically considered all federal, state, and local permitting requirements, as well as a right-of-way evaluation. These permitting processes are fairly consistent with previously studied CCS projects. Most of these permits that are needed for constructions are fairly routine, minimal time for preparation, and just a modest application fee. Where we considered additional timing for our permitting matrix was wherever there's a public comment period. Obviously, there's been some pretty high profile cases of public comments derailing some pipeline projects. So we wanted to kind of point those out as potential pinch points that need to be considered carefully. And then the full list of permits is in the final technical report. So the business case and cost estimate, we considered both of our scenarios that I covered earlier, as well as for the existing sources only. If we just considered pipeline transport, considered less trucking, and considered less rail. So those are 1A, 1B, and 1C. We did CapEx and OpEx 45Q incentives and cash flow model. We assumed standard economic conditions over 30 years for our hub, and then completed a technoeconomic assessment and business case analysis. We also had TRC companies as a partner, and they have a very good internal database for estimating pipeline costs. So we took advantage of their database to compare to our assessment using public data. And then we reviewed the net present value and internal rate of return for each scenario, break-even pricing and carbon efficiency. And then, this is really considered an initial overview of the breakdown of the primary cost drivers. Obviously, this is a pre-feed study, so it's not the final answer, but intended to kind of get us in the ballpark. So the one of the things that here is obviously the number to focus in on here is the break-even price, and the 1A scenario where we're only considering pipeline is technically the lowest cost, and this is because it's often the most efficient route to transport. But the one thing I would say here is that um, particularly for a lot of these smaller sources, it's not always feasible to build a large pipeline. So this low break-even price is not really considering the overall feasibility of actually constructing this and sinking in the capital for a fairly small source. Um, in addition, there is no adder or additional factor for what if you go down this route and the public backlash is such that that the pipeline never gets built. So there isn't that kind of risk layered into this. But ultimately, these aren't astronomical costs, per ton costs. They're kind of within the range of what we would have expected for an intermodal transport hub. And then for our business case analysis, we considered a moderate growth scenario, where essentially the capture and transport infrastructure would expand incrementally. Um, in this scenario, early projects would really rely on that truck and rail to move CO₂ to nearby injection wells. Um, these are the early movers that have smaller sources of CO₂, so rail and truck is a little more feasible. And then this also allows for flexible deployment, minimizing those upfront capital costs until some of these things are actually proven out. And then in a high growth scenario with aggressive climate policy, carbon markets, and industrial decarbonization mandates, the region could see a rapid build out of these networks. We kind of compared it to the development of natural gas infrastructure in the early 2000s.
Hey, Jared, can we maybe just
Okay.
quickly
Yep.
finish in a minute? Right.
Sure.
Thanks.
So HADS ID, we did a qualitative risk assessment. We did a roundtable for the impact assessment, and then a bow tie assessment where we identified our top line events is a leak of CO₂ from each of our three modes, and we identified some threats and causes, some consequences, mitigations, recovery options, and threats to these, and mitigations to the threats to those. The next step is kind of hub expansion. So we did an assessment of the other sources in the area, and basically applied our I applied our decision tree analysis to them, and came up with what modes of transport would be required for each of these sources, and additional CCUS projects and other carbon removal projects listed on the bottom map here were also studied, and we could consider those in future work. So next steps is a feed study. So these, and at this point we would be reaching out to additional sources that are planning capture projects, as well as rail and trucking companies to get more realistic information, refine the concept, and define some of the specific equipment. Obviously, outreach to the regulatory and permitting entities would be a pretty crucial part of the feed study, and then refinement of the project costs and HAS ID and environmental safety and health.